Is FSU out as an ACC team? Will Clemson potentially follow? Is Fox News, or did they admit to lying about the 2020 election? And also, did coronavirus actually come from a Chinese lab? All that and more in this episode. So just so you guys know, it is going to be another solo episode. We're going to have a little bit of a change happening here in the Always On family. That will be announced later in the show. But for starters, let's get into it. Let's get right into the fun news of the day. This has been a couple of days coming. Excuse me. We have a really, I can't call it earth shattering, but maybe some more shifting sands in the world of college football. FSU met with their board of commissioners, I believe it was last week, talking about a potential buyout of the ACC contract that currently goes through 2036. This, I don't think, is necessarily a shock to anybody, but it is something that is potentially a landscape change in the sport. It might be another big brand. You would only assume if they're talking about it, Clemson in the ACC is also discussing it, potentially Miami and North Carolina, the most predominant basketball schools associated with that conference. You would only imagine that those four schools are probably in cohorts together, in collusion, if you will, chattering it up about what the potential looks like for them in the world of, the expanding conferences, the expanding playoff, and how really just TV rights deals, especially within the SEC and Big Ten, are going to potentially put these teams behind the eight ball. And realistically, how are they going to be able to compete? Because the ACC's product, as it's currently constructed in football, is not going to garner the amount of money in media rights when they renegotiate and how they renegotiate in 2036 versus what the SEC and the Big Ten are bringing to the table. So that being said, let's just jump right into it. It looks like FSU's president, I believe his name here is Michael Alford. He basically just came out flatly last week, and I think the ACC administrators amongst all the schools were meeting, and he just came out flat and said it, that we need to have a restructuring of how the ACC revenue is split. They, just so everybody has a good baseline, they distributed about $36 million per school this year, just north of that number, shy of what the SEC did, which I believe was around $46 million, somewhere of that. So that's a $10 million discrepancy that is only set to increase as new media rights deals with the SEC and especially the Big Ten start to work their way into just reality. As we all know, believe it was back in 2020, the SEC re-upped with ESPN, basically putting all their product on the ESPN network. The Big Ten issued, I believe it was last year or the year before in 2021, they signed a media rights deal with CBS, Fox, and NBC to broadcast their games. Each of those respective deals will net, once they finally come into fruition, net each of those conferences. The schools are estimated to have, with the SEC, it's somewhere in the range of 75 million, if not more. And with the Big Ten, it's going to be around $80 million per school. So what that means is that as it's currently constructed, as we mentioned just a second ago, the ACC is giving around $36 million per school at the end of the year due to their cut of the current pie. Obviously, everything amongst these conferences at the moment is even. And if you just put those numbers together, do a little bit of quick math, 70 million and 80 million is, well, in the 80 million case, over double. And then in the 70 million case with the SEC, probably it's really going to average somewhere between 73 and like $77 million. That's double as well. So when you're looking at the world of recruiting, NIL, all that good stuff, it's going to be very difficult for schools such as Clemson and Florida to keep with the Joneses when it comes to just battling it out for recruits. And obviously, as we know, recruiting is the lifeblood of good college football. Check out Alabama, check out Georgia, check out Ohio State over the past 10 years in their recruiting record, and then also look at their on-the-field success, and you'll be able to see clearly, okay, in black and white, that if you're recruiting at a high level, obviously there's other factors. You need good coaching, you need competent scheduling, but there's a disparity when it comes to on the field success. So that leads people like the Mike Alfreds of the world to realize, hey, if we're going to have any shot, we're already making less money under the current TV deals these conferences have. If we're going to have any shot of keeping up with them, especially once Oklahoma and Texas join the SEC, and also once UCLA and USC join the Big Ten, it's going to be hard because their product offering is just going to give them more ability to negotiate higher contracts. I think it's just that evident. And these athletic directors and presidents of these universities who sort of just see the writing on the wall are obviously noticing that we've got to do something. And so I want to share this article here that we have from Florida State. And it's a pretty good one. I think ESPN did a bang-up job on this. Here we go. And so you can here's what Michael Alfred said. He goes, at the end of the day, Florida State is not going to be able to compete nationally, Alfred told the board. Something has to change moving forward. Their proposed changes, and we're going to look at this breakdown that ESPN says, their proposed changes is so that the schools, as Alfred puts it, who are more willing and able and wanting to double down on their football successes on the field and provide more of the revenue to the conference as far as, their fan base's engagement, their fan base's generating money, they get a weighted or graded slice of that pie. So essentially their piece is going to get bigger, or they're wanting it to get bigger, so they can obviously get more than $36 million a year. And, the Wake Forest of the world, who actually have been respectable the past few years in football relative to their past, who don't really care. They're more academics focused. They are essentially going to get a lesser share of that. And as we can see here, this is the paragraph that I think is the most telling that we were talking about earlier, and I'll just read it verbatim. In the next few years, new TV deals for the SEC and Big Ten will kick in that'll provide member institutions of those leagues with $30 to $40 million more annually than FSU will receive from the ACC. As we said a moment ago, the ACC distributed a record $36.1 million per full-time member in the 2020-2021 season, a number that should only grow slightly now that the league has full distribution of the ACC network. The SEC's upcoming TV contract, however, is expected to result in more than $70 million per team, while the Big Ten, their new deal, is expected to distribute at least $80 million per team. As you can tell, that is massive money we're talking. That is per team's rights. And in this age of obviously people trying to stream on YouTube and just a very fractured media environment, the big draws besides the NFL is college football. That's what puts eyeballs on the TV screens. I was looking at an ESPN press release that was talking about the biggest games in college football. Alabama, Florida, LSU, Ohio State were among the likes of the biggest draws TV-wise. And they were getting roughly, I think the big games were getting around 8 million people, 8 to about high 5 million average viewership. So that in this world is a ton of people watching. And the very next paragraph, it goes to show a little bit of the disparity that Florida State is trying to offer. So Florida State, obviously, I'm going to read it again. They split the league's profits evenly amongst the 13 member institutions of the ACC. A share of the portions partially go to Notre Dame due to their involvement of basically everything except football. So they actually have precedent in the league right now that, hey, if you're not, a full-time member, especially in football, you're not going to get a big slice of that pie. But Alfred told the board of the Seminoles, who are responsible for a far greater, that the Seminoles are responsible for a far greater percentage of that revenue, as much as 15%, that a consulting firm they hired, gave that opinion. How high that number truly is not able to truly be determined, but it's probably above what it says here, the 7% that the league gets in payouts, or excuse me, that the university gets in league payouts. So that's pretty sizable. If you look at it in that respect, Florida State is, providing double the value of what they're bringing back in as university. I would imagine this is probably along the lines of how they would want the revenue to be split their way. If we're bringing in what is garnered to be 15% of the viewership, we believe that we should be getting it probably about 15% of that revenue on its face. In my opinion, especially as you're struggling to try and get as much money as you can so you can put into facilities, put into your coaching staffs, put into your recruiting staffs, it just makes sense, right? That this is the argument that they're going to propose to try and put themselves in the best position to flourish in the widening playoff landscape and get themselves at the top of the heap once again. Clemson is probably in the same boat here, but they're just not out and about saying it in public at the moment. I would imagine behind closed doors, both those two schools, who are, let's just face it, the predominant members of those institutions from just a prestige standpoint in the football world, and football is king amongst sports, it's going to carry a lot of weight. How receptive the other member institutions will be to give those guys a bigger piece of the pie is yet to be determined. If you're just contemplating the realities, if you're a Wake Forest of the world, if you're a Virginia of the world, potentially a Virginia Tech who has fallen on hard times, it might be to your advantage to do something like this now, give them a bigger piece of the pie now so they don't get poached by what would likely be the SEC. Just geographically, it makes sense. Geographics has sort of been thrown out the window in college football expansion when it comes to Big 12 having now teams in Florida, teams in West Virginia, and the Big 10 soon to have teams out in California. And Lord only knows if they get the likes of an Oregon or Washington later on. So the SEC has, for the most part, stayed within a realm. Once they made that expansion in 2011 to include Missouri and A&M, Texas and Oklahoma, it's not really expanding too much further west. And I don't think the SEC has any, who knows, the SEC has any, dreams of going that much further. If I had to pin it, I've already had conversations amongst my buddies, especially ones who are FSU fans. Me as a Gator, them as FSU fans, we're always talking smack. I gauged it by 2035. That's closer to when their media rights deal is, but I gauged it as 2035 as to when they're out. And I'm only presuming the SEC will give and extend those institutions. My thought would be, at minimum, Clemson and Florida State, extend to them invitations to join the SEC. It pains me to say that as a Florida Gator because I don't want them to join. I would imagine if Florida State had their way and the ACC was a solid conference, giving them as much revenue as the SEC potentially could, I don't think they would necessarily want to join. One, because it's just an easier conference to win. And two, I don't think that they want to necessarily be a part of the SEC just due to decades of, ingrained hatred. But money talks. And what they mentioned in this article, too, was a potential buyout. And that has been floated around, that a potential buyout from their current rights deal was estimated on the low end to be about $120 million. That, to me, is probably a realistic number on the low end. But this is a deal that's gone through or is going through as far as their, rights that are signed over from a media deal perspective to the ACC through 2036. I don't foresee this changing truly at all until a few years down the road. But I think they're trying to get the discussion started. I would imagine that $120 million number, if they're trying to leave within the next year or two, I say you probably have to double that, truly. I would say doubling that, right? So 120, you're looking at 240. I would really probably peg the number if they're trying to leave by, let's say 2025, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 and $300 million. I would probably really lean probably 275 to $300 million. Absolutely astronomical amounts of money. But if you're looking at it in the grand scheme, well, if you're going over to the SEC and you're getting $70 million a year, or potentially the Big Ten and getting $80 million a year, right? Just the quick math, 140. So that's about 4 years, 5 years of revenue. And then once they renegotiate, as those two will inevitably do in the mid 2030s, early and mid 2030s, it's only going to be more money. Because by that time, if the SEC acquires the media rights and has Florida State and Clemson join their program, or excuse me, their league, they're worth even more. Those brands are maybe not as prestigious as a Texas or an Oklahoma, but they're right up there. And the SEC, they're going to have one of the best products, only besides the Big Ten in the entire country. I would argue, again, I am biased. I'm an SEC guy through and through, but I would say top to bottom, if those two teams came over, God forbid if you were to get a Miami of the world or potentially North Carolina, who's not really hot shakes in football, but they bring other things to the table, basketball in particular. The media rights deal there would be awesome, just awesome. And so that being said, $120 million is definitely on the low end, but you can totally see where FSU is coming from here. I don't think that it's really, I think it's smart of them to get ahead of this, hopefully get themselves a bigger piece. Because if you can get potentially 15% versus 7, I don't know the math of that off the top of my head, and I'm not quick enough to do the math to where it'd be accurate. But you're probably talking, if they were to get 15% of the revenue that comes in, well, they're cut between themselves and Clemson, who would probably be it, and then maybe Miami, because those I would imagine are the big three. You would only imagine that it's going to be in that ballpark. I would think that those schools could suffer the consequences of making like $60 million rather than 70. Is it a $10 million shortfall? Yes, but that's already the shortfall that they have under the current, just under the current money distribution at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think that this is only going to be something that heats up in the years to come. I think it's inevitable that the SEC and the Big Ten expand more. I truly think that you're going to see the college football world eventually become just a 2 instead of a Power 5. I truly believe it's just going to be a Power 2. No offense to the Big 12, who has actually done a good job positioning itself in such a way that it can hang. But once you have Texas and Oklahoma out, even with the institutions of Houston, BYU, UCF, and Cincinnati, all solid football programs at the moment, they just don't have the cachet that an SEC or Big Ten would be able to bring, especially the Big Ten were to potentially get Oregon and Washington. You're just talking about schools. Washington isn't too much to brag home about, but once you include Oregon and the likes of UCLA and USC, well, now you're cooking with gas. Potentially added Utah in there from a football perspective, and you're talking about big boy football schools in the Big Ten now. Probably Notre Dame would eventually get sucked up by the Big Ten too. It just kind of makes geographic sense. And you're really now just speaking about two conferences that I think it's all starting to trend to that NFL model where you have AFC, NFC. I've always been of the opinion that eventually these conferences, the players are going to unionize. They're going to have collective bargainings. And while I love the free market and I don't want that to happen, I'm hoping that things can shape up how with the NIL as it's currently structured to keep it going for a couple decades to come. But I would have to say by around 2040, 2050, I think it's just, and again, that's a long ways off. I'm projecting long into the future here. But I just foresee that the road just tends to look like it's going to become more semi-pro. I could even see a potential where the schools lease out their images and likenesses for a pretty hefty sum, and the athletic department's no longer truly even affiliated from a student-athlete perspective with the school. So now you're essentially just creating semi-pro across the board. I think it kind of makes the most sense that way, realistically, to just now you can pay the softball players a little bit, but less. Maybe those type of sports that make less, so swimming, diving, track, and field, who make no money, they're just a cost on the overall budget of that athletic program. Maybe those students still get compensated with a scholarship and our actual students, but I foresee the day where basketball and football at minimum are essentially no longer affiliated with the school in a student athlete sense, but are, wearing their name, image, and likeness, if you will, for the foreseeable future. So we have developments happening there that are going to be interesting. A couple other things developing before we leave the sports world is the only real thing of note that I care to talk about is we have the Arnie Palmer Invitational. Get your sweet tea and lemonade, take a sip, sit on back. We're going to have a good weekend in front of us with the Arnie Palmer Invitational. This is one of the PGA Tour's designated events. They've come out with a new schedule or offering that is going. We will go over it probably more Monday so I can get a little more in depth on it. But it's essentially a little bit of a change, sort of going to that live model. On these big boy tournaments, you're going to have less players competing for more money in the hopes that the big boys come out and play. So in this tournament, you do have the big boys. Besides Tiger Woods, who's not in the field just because he's aging, has health issues. That makes sense. But right now, you have John Rahm leading the tournament at 7 under, and then you have a leaderboard that is full of guys that are going to be these big names that carry the PGA Tour going forward. You have Xander Schauffele up there at 4 under. He's tied for 5th. Ricky Fowler up there at 4 under, tied for 5th. You have Scotty Scheffler there again, 4 under. Jordan Spieth, 4 under. Keegan Bradley, all there at 4 under and tied for 5th currently. And it's going to be one of these things that as the PGA, sorry, I thought I saw Rory, but it was something Rye. I don't know this golfer's name, but he's tied for 4th as well at 4 under, an Englishman. So as this stuff goes along, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the PGA Tour. I think it's smart. Liv, came out with some snarky thing where they were saying that, copying is the best form of flattery, and whatever. I don't think, again, I'm not a big Liv guy, but what they have been able to do is push the PGA to make some much needed innovations that for a big golf junkie like myself, make the program, if you want to call it, but make the product that much more prestigious, make the product that much more palpable to people who may not be big golf fans, just golf novices, maybe there for the majors. But if you can create a schedule where, okay, you still have the 4 big majors, the Open, PGA, US Open, and Masters, and then you can now whittle in about 4 or 5 more big events, whether that be the Players, whether that be the Dell Match Play, the Arnold Palmer Invitational, amongst others, and really make those fields hotly contested just like you would in the majors. You can get a lot better product and bang for your buck. There's going to be things that are concerns of it or that have already been, made aware, but we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. But I wanted to at least touch on the Arnie Palmer Invitational because it's one of my favorites. Can't wait for that this weekend. Guys, tune in on ESPN and all the other networks. I believe CBS will also have it. And enjoy yourselves in the sports world. There's a lot of stuff still going on. Basketball's in full swing with March Madness right around the corner. We'll cover that a little bit more as we get into it. I have been, the past 2 years especially, a little bit detached from the basketball world. I've been detached from the NBA for quite some time because I think the NBA's product is just terrible these days. It really is. For about 5 to 10 years now, I have just not had the interest that I did back in the mid 90s as I was growing up as a kid, and the 2000s when my boy Kobe and Shaq were dominating the league and LeBron was coming in. I just thought the basketball was better. They weren't as much, they were always prima donnas. You're talking about sporting athletes, especially one in basketball. But the nature of the game has just changed. You can maybe blame that on Steph Curry and the introduction of just ridiculous threes. Or you could potentially say the lack of physicality that you can get in other sports that you used to get in the NBA is no longer there. There's just a plethora of things going on in the NBA that are But when it comes to the college world, there's things I don't like about that either. The one and dones kill me. That's detached me a little bit from basketball. But the big reason I haven't been following as much as I used to, especially a couple years ago, is my Florida Gators are just not that good. As much as I would love to say when, Billy Donovan was at Florida and they were just on a roll, obviously won back-to-back national championships and 06 and 07. I believe it was 05, 06. It was a great time to be a Florida Gator. Really was. I ate, drank, and slept basketball, but nowadays it's just a little bit harder for you to get into it when sometimes you don't even know who half these players are on a team. At the beginning of the year, you're trying to know who Kentucky even has on their team because it's a whole new crew year in, year out. Same goes with how Florida's been. You don't really get as invested as you do for a guy who's been there 1, 2, 3. Now this is very far out of the norm, but even 4 years. So that's something that we will talk about further. We got teams that are on the bubble. Do I know who? No, but I will be looking into it more as we, get closer to the tourney time and we get closer to the conference tournaments. Florida is so far out of any conference tournament, or excuse me, any national championship. Good Lord, NCAA tourney talk, that it's hard for me. I will always watch because the first weekend of the tournament is arguably the best sports you can have on offer besides maybe a Super Bowl or a national championship game in football. There's honestly nothing wilder than that first weekend of the tournament when it just comes to upsets. So we'll get you there. Speaking of people who are upset, though, we're going to dive into the one big topic of the American news I want to talk about. And then there's another thing in the world news that I want to touch on, but it's Fox News, whose owner, Rupert Murdoch, had a deposition and the defamation case where Dominion Voting, who was running a lot of these, voting machines in the 2020 election, is suing Fox News for $1.6 billion in damages in a defamation case, claiming that Fox News knowingly and willfully slandered their name and was, propagating a false narrative that the 2020 election was stolen. Whether or not you believe it, I tend to believe that, of course, there's fraud happening in every election. Yeah, it just is, right? I mean, but do I think it was at the scale that it was in 2020 or that the former president Donald Trump tries to persuade people of? I don't buy it. I don't think that in the 6 states that he needed to win, that every single one of them, and some of which were by pretty drastic margins, that they were all rigged against him. If you wanted to give me 1 or 2 states, I'm still not going to buy the argument, but let's say Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. Okay. Well, even if he won all 3 of those states, he still ain't winning the election. So, it would have to be widespread fraud across all that. And then you get into the piece of how did some of these states still retain Republican senators, but yet they only rigged one guy at the top? If I'm a Democrat and I'm trying to get rid of Donald Trump, well, why not rig a couple other spots too so I can have more senators and more congressmen so the incoming president, who inevitably was Joe Biden, has a little more wiggle room to play with instead of having a 50-50 split in the Senate and a very, very tight Congress? I don't know. Just on its face, it never made sense. But Fox News, and I believe it's, what is it, OAN, One America News, who apparently I believe has, don't quote me on this one, but I believe has ties to Russia in some weird way. They were going hard and fast. OAN was for sure that the election was rigged. The election was rigged. And Fox News, some of their primetime hosts did as well. And so Rupert Murdoch, and let me share this with you just so we can all see it together. Rupert Murdoch came out saying, and here we go. And so it says right here, Rupert Murdoch, the chairman of the conservative media empire that owns Fox News, acknowledged in a deposition that several hosts of his network promoted false narratives in the 2020 election, promoted false narratives that the 2020 election was stolen from former President Donald J. Trump, and that he could have stopped them but didn't. Court documents released showed, quote, said Murdoch, they endorsed, unquote, Murdoch said under oath in response to direct questions about the Fox News hosts. And these were the ones that are the big time, election deniers. Sean Hannity, I believe her name is Janine Pirro, Lou Dobbs, who's no longer with the company. I don't believe Pirro is either. And Maria Bertamino. I know her last name when I hear it, but I can't pronounce it here. I believe she's still with Fox. And of course, Tucker Carlson also is in that ilk, but he's not listed in this article. And then again, it just says, according to a legal filing by Dominion, voting systems. He said, Murdoch, quote, I would have liked for us to be stronger in denouncing it in hindsight, unquote. He added, while also disclosing that he was always dubious of Trump's claims that widespread voter fraud occurred. So this is the head of Fox News saying that he didn't even believe that Trump truly, was being honest in his, accusations that the 2020 election was stolen from him. There was also stuff that was released where internal text, and I think it's going to come here in these documents. It could be further in this article, but I don't want to waste anybody's time. Where it shows that some of these primetime hosts, whether it be, the Sean Hannity's of the world, I believe Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson were talking amongst themselves, saying that the election wasn't stolen and that this whole thing is a farce. I agree with them. I wish they said that on their shows because I think it would have spared a lot of people a lot of pain. I think that what inevitably happened in January 6th may or may not happen if the, Fox News establishment was just honest with the facts that were on the ground and not necessarily bending facts or twisting and spinning information to pander to their audience. And it just goes to show how media organizations, and you can say this is the same thing with the CNNs of the world, the MSNBCs of the world, when it came to Trump-Russia collusion. Their audience wanted it, and they fed their audiences what they want. The same is true in this Fox News instance. That's one of the reasons I want to do this show, is just to be completely blunt and honest with what we see. I'm obviously of a conservative bent, but I like to call balls and strikes when I see it. I like to point out conservative flaws when they go against what I truly believe. I'm a free market capitalist type of guy who's big on liberty, big on free speech, big on you just being able to do what you want in the privacy of your own home. And for the most part, out in the world, as long as you're not harming another person. So those are things we're going to try and do here as we grow the YouTube channel. We're going to have a little bit of announcements as to how some of these things may break up in the future. But back to this news, in my opinion, should Fox have been stronger in denouncing it? Yes. But their media rating, they're hungry for media ratings. They had a news site, OAN News, which is now no longer really on these big time cable packages because they were so ridiculous, drawing viewers away from them. I think they had a huge ratings nosedive as the president was basically calling out Fox News. And to me, if you're worth your salt as a news organization, you report the news as you see it. You can have your spin on it. You can have, because again, Sean Hannity, Janine, Lou Dobbs, and Maria, they're all opinions hosts. They're all on the opinion side of Fox News. The Brett Bairs of the world, who are on the news side, I think for the most part do a pretty upstanding job of reporting the news. And there are those guys at CNN. I think Jake Tapper is one of those gentlemen who, for the most part, does a pretty good job, even though he is on the opinion side, does a pretty good job of reporting the truth. And he does give it a little more of a liberal spin. He's clearly on that side of the aisle. No problem about it, in my opinion, as long as you're honest about where it's coming from. Because I think if you're trying to be a true blue media or a news media organization, just being open and honest about your biases is important. I think MSNBC is truly more open and honest. I think Fox has become that way a little bit too over the years. CNN, in my opinion, should be the gold standard of neutral news. And they're not, right? I mean, I think that's clearly evident that they're not. Fox News, though, had audience capture. And to me, is this a symptom of the clickbait culture where essentially you're just, having to run for news, as we talked about in the sports side of this? When it comes to the product of the football teams, it's a very fragmented media world out there, and you're hunting for ratings, right? Otherwise, you're not going to get the ad dollars that you want. You're not going to be able to pay for your investigative journalists. You're not going to be able to pay for your mainstream hosts if you're not being able to actually bring in some sort of revenue. And that's been an issue, especially with the MSNBCs and CNNs, even Fox News to an extent. But if we're talking about their actual ratings, they don't get that high of ratings. I believe, the biggest actual news show, I think, is still Tucker Carlson's. And if I'm not mistaken, he only makes or only averages, excuse me, about 1 million people per episode. So let's see how many people watch Tucker Carlson. And so we're going to see. Let's see if it actually gives me an average. Okay, so I'm wrong. In prime time, it's actually a lot bigger. So it said in April 2020, Carlson's program surpassed Hannity as the highest-rated primetime cable show in news, with an average audience of 4.56 million viewers. That's, quadruple what I was expecting. However, if you take that into account, that's one college football game, right? That's one college football game. Over the course of a weekend, you have tens of millions of people watching a college football game. That number compared to, let's say, a CNN of the world, they're maybe averaging at best 1 million, if that, right? They're head time guys. I know that one for a fact. I don't even know who the main CNN draw is anymore. But these are things that, a Tucker Carlson, if he has 4.5 million people watching, let's just round it up to 4.6. And he is under the impression that most of them are believing that Donald Trump is correct in saying that the election was stolen. Because let's be honest, if you're watching any of these news channels, as hardcore as they are, especially for just how unbelievably biased you're just looking for your own confirmation, right? You're just looking to confirm your own biases through these shows. And unfortunately, a lot of these people, and I know they're making buku bucks, are willing to give that to them. And that's something that's unfortunate, because I think it leads to a lot of negative things. I think whether it be the riots during COVID or the Capitol 6 riot or some of the just mayhem we're seeing in the world today, at least in America, it's not good. And mayhem may be too strong of a word, but the disgruntlement that you seem to find, whether it be on social media and the like. We're going to have a video here in a little bit that probably shows a little more of the humanity in America. I truly don't believe the United States is as bad as social media and the news portray it. I do think there's a lot more good apples out there than bad. But it does seem that there is an uptick, and the stats sort of just don't, deny that there is an uptick, whether it be in murder, just general crime, and all these sorts of things, just due to the fact, there's a multitude of issues, but just due to the fact that we're all essentially looking to confirm our own biases. And I, for one, have been guilty of that in the past. I think I admitted a few episodes ago that when I was first thinking about the Brandon Miller incident with Alabama, when I first saw it on social media and the facts, the story that I was presented, I was all for lock that man up. What's he doing playing for Alabama? But as you dive a little bit deeper into the story from the facts we have presented to us right now, it's a little bit harder to justify going that far overboard. Not saying that something may come to light to where it's like, dude, whoa, what was going on there? But you are innocent until proven guilty in this country. And I think we need to keep that fact in our mind's eye when we're dealing with things like this. But I think, will Fox probably have to pay $1.6 million in damages due to defamation to Dominion voting systems? I don't really know. I don't know. But it is just, the fakery at Fox is just a little bit much for how it's going. It gives me a little bit of a distaste for what that establishment, which was once a pretty good conservative bastion for, what they used to say, fair and balanced news. Their news section is still solid for the most part. Brett Baer, I think, is a shining example of that. Martha McCallum is also pretty solid. But it does leave you with a bad taste in your mouth, because obviously they're trying to push something. Now they don't really hide from it. But it makes me respect it a little bit more of like the Daily Wires of the world. It's a podcast more than it is the Huffington Post of the world, which I'm not trying to equate Daily Wire and Huffington Post, but they are more outspoken as to, this is what we're talking about. This is what we believe. These are our biases. The Huffington Post doesn't really beat around the bush saying that they're an ultra liberal outlet. Daily Wire doesn't really beat around the bush that they're a very conservative outlet. So we're gonna have to see where this goes. But it doesn't do good, especially in the populist moment that we're in, that we have news organizations that aren't, speaking the truth, or at least speaking the facts as we currently know them. They're more pandering to their bases and giving just more fuel to that populist fire. Me just knowing my general history, being a history nut, and those are things that may be coming forward in the program later on as we develop. These are just the sorts of things that, especially if you just go look back at Roman history, you don't get a Caesar without a really big populist upswell within the Roman Empire. Now, does populism always have a negative connotation? No, there can be positives that come from it, but you just can't let that boiling pot spill over or get too crazy, because otherwise, true mayhem will ensue. And speaking of mayhem, let's get to Alex Murdaugh, a South Carolina really mainstay in the southern part of South Carolina. I believe his father and grandfather were, I don't know the exact titles of what they did, but essentially they were very famous lawyers within the community. Alex Murdaugh, for his own, you know, worth, was apparently not too half bad himself before he was also doing a lot of sketchy stuff. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this story, but it has captured a little bit of the American nation just due to the fact that he is found guilty now officially tonight. It is Thursday, roughly 9 o'clock. This will be coming out Friday morning, but he's been found guilty of the killing of his wife and son at their South Carolina hunting lodge. If you look at just the basics of the piece, we'll touch on it again Tuesday, maybe even something this weekend if I can get lucky enough to do it. Just sort of a little bit of a special going over this guy. He's sketchy, okay? He's very, very sketchy, and he was probably going to go to jail if he wasn't found guilty of these crimes. There's been some things where he essentially stole money. There was a murder earlier I guess later in last decade, but earlier in his life, of a former mate of his who died mysteriously, and he somehow got her insurance money. There was also an incident with one of his children. A friend of his died sort of mysteriously. A bunch of crazy stuff. This family basically ran, I don't want to say ran roughshod, but was a, big swinging what within that southern South Carolina county that they were in. And this guy eventually got caught up on his own farts, or high on his own farts, let's say, and it all came back to roost on him. He thought he was untouchable, but someone got him touched. And so he is now, I would imagine, going to be potentially sentenced to death, if not life in prison. You would only have to assume. For me, I'm and we can probably talk about this on a later podcast too. I'm a death penalty guy for things like this. If you're murdering your wife and kid, and then you have the gall to go up on the stand thinking that you're going to be able to get yourself out of something, just shows that you're kind of a psychopath and you should be killed. Same goes for any mass shooter of a school. I think you should also, one of the biggest tragedies, I think, at least in Florida history, recent history, is that the Parkland shooter, I believe his name was Nicholas Cruz, was sentenced to life versus being sentenced to death. That dude should be dead, or he should be on death row, and we should expedite that murder or that killing. But either way, that's neither here nor there. This guy has now been found guilty. It was pretty point blank obvious that he did it. It is hard to be his defense lawyer, because there is no way defending the just diabolical deeds, the dirty deeds of this gentleman. Kudos to the jury to finding this guy guilty. I think it was pretty point blank evident that he was. And we may have a little bit of a special coming out that dives deeper into this. If not, you can go on YouTube. I know, speaking of the Daily Wire, the Ben Shapiro's of the world have had a good breakdown. I know on CNN and Fox News, they've also had pretty good breakdowns of this guy. One of my favorite news outlets, The Dispatch, with Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, that also has a pretty good rundown of what was going on here. So you can find this story if you want to rather easily. But I think justice has been served. One of the odder things going on, especially in the Twitter world, is that O.J. Simpson, a known murderer that got off, opined on this topic, which seems just a little bit out of left field. He has that right as a free man, but it's just like, OJ. I mean, I guess if anyone knows how to get out of a murder, it's that guy. But needless to say, the one thing I wanted to touch on before we leave here tonight, because this is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode, hasn't technically been so far, is that the FBI, and let me bring this up, the FBI seems to have come to the conclusion that, and same with the Department of Energy, oh no, that the coronavirus probably started in a Chinese lab. What a shock. So let me bring this up real quick. Ba-ba-ba-ba-da. So here we go. This is the FBI's official Twitter page. And it says right here, the FBI for quite some time now has assessed the origins of the pandemic and are most likely that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. I will likely, good Lord, I will just make the observation that the Chinese government has been doing its best to try and thwart and obfuscate the work here. The work that we're doing, the work that our U.S. government and close foreign partners are doing. So essentially, they're trying to say that they believe and are under the impression that COVID started in Wuhan, and that the coronavirus lab that was in Wuhan. What a monumental shock! It's like no one had been purporting this or thinking that this was probably a very big potential, cause of the pandemic when it happened. So it's something that I'm glad that we have at least a few government agencies. Of course, the White House came out and tried to throw cold water on this. I think it's just pretty obvious, okay, that it makes more sense that this thing came from a lab in China than anything else. And if government funding went to this lab for what we all know now is gain of function research, so essentially making viruses more potent so we can hopefully come up with vaccines to fight them, which to me seems a little counterintuitive on its face. You can see why you do it, but doesn't seem like the smartest idea if you don't have the best health and safety protocols to not have leaks in labs in countries that aren't really known for being the greatest, whether it be in human rights or just security generally. So that looks to be good news that this is going to be further investigated. And as the FBI said, the Chinese government is trying to obfuscate the work that they're doing. The Chinese government themselves is trying to hide this, in my own personal opinion. We have done our damnedest. And you would think if the Chinese government could find some sort of bat or animal or anything that could have linked it to a wet market, that could link it to human infection, they would have tried to present that right now or by now. You'd think that would be their number one goal, is to throw that out there so that it does, not look like they caused the pandemic that it, at minimum killed roughly 5 to 10 million people around the world. You would have to think that number is probably higher, if we're just going to be honest, because who knows how many people, died, didn't report it, and, it never gets tested on them. So glad that this is finally coming to light. I think it's just so totally obvious. And the Chinese government has been so sketchy from the jump on this, because I believe it was March of 2020, maybe late February, where it started to get into America and proliferate around the world. Well, they had known since, I believe, August or September of that year that there was potentially an incident that was causing people to get sick, and they did absolutely nothing about it, because when you're in a country like that, you want to protect your prestige. I think the same thing, and not as bad of a light, is sort of going on with the United States, that there probably is money trails that suggest, and everybody's going to blame Fauci, which he deserves a boatload of blame. I think he's been an utter fraud when it comes to this whole situation, and not been truthful or transparent. That the National Institute of Health or whatever organizations give money to some of these researchers or institutions probably did give, may not been, the exact thing that started this virus, but have given money to institutions like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that led to this disease. And I think that these people get protective because they want to have science be funded. And on its face, I understand where you don't want to admit it because you want scientific research to keep happening. And you don't necessarily want the discussion that should this type of research be happening because you have the, I guess, moral high ground in your own eyes that it's fine. It's totally fine. So that's something that I'm glad comes to light. I hope that in the future, unfortunately, I think the time has passed for us to actually truly know what's going on. Because if I'm the Chinese government and I wanted to hide something like this, all the documents are long gone. Unless someone somewhere in China or potentially, in some cloud somewhere on some server somewhere has data that better suggests, what happened in the origins of this virus. Well, hopefully that comes out one day. But I think it's a disservice to every American, every European, every African, every South American, every Middle Easterner, every person in this world, even the Chinese people themselves, to not get to the bottom of what the hell happened here. Because it uprooted so many people's lives, so many people that are younger, especially in the United States or over in Europe, who had major life events taken from them because this virus was just so. Did we overreact? Fine, sure. I can probably say we did, but was so impactful and just wreaked havoc and tear from an emotional standpoint across societies that somebody needs to be held accountable for this. We need to learn from our mistakes. Will it happen? Probably not, but it is something that needs to be investigated further. It totally is. And so with that being said, we're sort of going to wrap up tonight. I want to have one quick thing that shows that the world is not all bad. The world is not all, blood and gore, that there are people out there who still have good bones in their bodies. And that's something I want to wrap the show on a good note. Oh, goodness. Let's see. I'm going to have to do it this way. Give me 1 second here. I thought I could share it, but apparently not. Here we go. And so here's a video I want to share that came. Disregard this guy's snarky comment, CCG Bryson. Here we go. But, where it says video, 3 thugs attack an elderly woman. But what I want to show is this happening, and I'm going to put it on so we all can hopefully hear it. Essentially, 3 gentlemen, clearly you can see that they're black, help an elderly woman get into her car after they saw that, the older gentleman was struggling. And this obviously warms your heart and makes you see the humanity that's still out there. And I want us all to share in it just so we can, one, praise these 3 dudes for being upstanding citizens and helping a fellow man in need. And let's play it.
3 young men helping an elderly couple struggling to get to their car.
Take it easy, y'all.
And so as you can
Sheriff's
see,
Deputy
they're helping
Felicia
her from
Carnegie
her
was
walker
driving
get
by
in
at
the
the
car.
time.
They open the
As I
door.
was sitting there, I looked to my left
And
and I
if the
noticed
audio
these
is not
young men
coming through,
helping
because I'm
this
not quite sure it
elderly
will or will
couple.
not,
So I went over to assist them.
this
I jumped out my
lady
truck, I went
right
over to
here,
assist
who's
them.
with the
And when
Levy
I
County
got there,
Sheriff's
they kind
Office,
of had it under control, So I thought
came
the
across
time
this
they looked really
happening, and she
beautiful. That was a
just
nice,
felt the need to get out there
scene,
and
I stepped back
record
and
some good
I
Samaritans
videoed.
doing good things.
Watch
And so,
the carefully lift
to me,
89-year-old Rose Grease into her car.
it's very
Rose's
nice to
100-year-old
see that,
husband
hey,
David stands
humanity is
nearby.
not lost. While
The
there's a
men
lot of
don't
bad
leave until
happening
they
in the
make sure the
world,
couple is safe.
there's still people out there who are kind-hearted and are doing the right thing. And that's something I think we need to show. I think, blood and guts sells, right? If it bleeds, it leads is the old news line. I obviously like to talk about some of the negative things happening in the world or more contentious things happening in the world, because I think that's where you can come to. We all agree that this is good, right? And if you don't, you're evil. But we all agree that this is a good thing to do. And I think we need to shed light on the good things that are happening in the world, because for the most part, America is still a very good place. I would say, probably 90% of the people in this country, hopefully, want to be good people, want to do good for themselves, their family, and, their neighbors if they have the opportunity to do it. And it's good to see that, these 3 gentlemen were kind enough to make that a reality, at least in this instance. It's those small little things of gratitude, of humility that just go a long way. It brings, honestly, a little bit of a tear to my eye just looking at it, because we're just so caught up, whether it be in social media or the news of the divisions, especially amongst races, right? That seems to be the topic du jour these days, is how, oh, blacks and whites are like cats and dogs. They'll never get along. But that's not the truth, right? People, for the most part, want to help other people when the opportunity presents itself. I think these are the types of things we need to encourage within society. Be more selfless, be more helping. And kudos to those three men. And hopefully more things like this can come out to light in social media, because they need to. They need to. So that being said, we're going to wrap the show up. What I want to quickly end the show with is a little bit of changes that are coming to the Always On entertainment family. Reed Carter has informed me that he is unfortunately no longer going to be able to participate on a regular basis in the Always On episodes. With that said, he always has an invitation to come in as a guest, but he will no longer be my co-host. Obviously, there are things happening in his life that have taken his availability to be on this show off the table. Maybe one day he can join in some more of a sustained capacity, but if he ever wants to come in and be a guest and talk about certain topics, we're always happy to have him. So for that, hopefully he will, be able to attend to the needs in his personal life. Nothing obviously too crazy. It's just, again, we're all pressed for time, and it's hard to, dedicate time to growing an enterprise like this. I totally understand. But that being said, on the growth front, we're going to see some changes, hopefully, for the better of Always On, whether it be audio, whether it be visual. Now that, Reed is not necessarily going to be a consistent guest on here or a co-host, we're going to be able to bring up the quality from a video and audio standpoint. So some of those changes you'll see come next week. We're also going to try and grow as some of our programming goes. I think we're going to start breaking it up potentially, because what I like to do is to have, let's talk about sports, let's talk about news, let's talk about things happening in the culture. I don't like to bleed sports with news, news with sports, culture with sports. I like to take them each individually. So, I'm always been the type of guy, if we're going to talk sports, let's talk sports. If we're going to talk politics, let's talk politics. Let's not induce or inject our politics or, ideas into sports, because I think sports is one of those common dominions that we all can enjoy together, and we shouldn't be interjecting politics into everything, because that just causes contention. It causes people to think in more partisan ways, and it's just not good for anybody's health. So what I think we're going to potentially do, and I just want to be honest with the audience, not that there's that many out there who even make it this long, but what I want to do is make it to where, hey, maybe each episode is going to be like little short. So probably 15 to 30-minute blips of what's going on in sports. Another one of what's going on in politics. Another one, what's going on in like culture, tech, music, movies. So we can sort of have a more wide-ranging discussion on these things and keep it nice and tight to what the topic is at hand, instead of having, 2-hour-long marathon sessions. Maybe as we grow, and if that's what people want, we can do it that way. But I do like having it to where, hey, you know exactly what you're getting when you click on the video. So with that being said, all these changes are going to be happening. There's going to be some series that I'm going to try and do coming up. The big one that I have on the top of my mind is one I'm thinking about calling Fat to Fit. Because as you may or may not know, your boy's a little bit out of shape, and I need to get myself in shape. So I think going from fat to fit is a goal a lot of Americans can strive for. There aren't just, 30-year-old 300-pounders. It ain't just me out here. There's a lot of us, unfortunately. So getting that, paunch into punch, right? Getting that fat into firm, getting that sloppy into skinny. Those are things that we're going to try and do over the course of that series. I shouldn't say try. Those are things we will do over the course of that series, and I want you guys along for the ride. So with that, if you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, share. We're going to inevitably get this on just a podcast feed itself, so you can just listen to the audio. Hopefully, my sweet baritone, if that's even the octave range that I'm in, is enjoyable to you guys. But with that being said, enjoy your weekend. Maybe you'll see a little special coming from us. Love you guys. See you next time. Adios.